Hi again. So we're finishing off a discussion of the free will paradox, and I've listed our three claims: the free will thesis, the causal determinism thesis, and the incompatibilism thesis. Last video, I went through reasons and arguments of why we might think that each of them is true, and I also emphasized again that they can't all three be true. So not only is the paradox a product of three claims, each of which seems true but can't all three be true, but your position on the free will debate is defined by which you reject. This is going to be familiar to some of you who are paying attention in the mind-body unit, because when we're looking at the mind-body problem, we define that as a problem that comes about when we were looking at four claims that all seemed true, but one of them had to go. And we saw that there were certain views in the mind-body problem where it was defined by which claim you reject and which claims you accept. The same thing here, only this time we're dealing with three claims instead of four. So let me give you those positions and say quickly a bit about them, and then later I'm going to have some videos where we talk in more detail about each of these three views. The first one is hard determinism. And as you might guess from the name, the hard determinist accepts 2 and 3, but rejects 1. So the hard determinist says, yes, causal determinism thesis is true. Yes, the incompatibilism thesis is true as well. You can't have the causal determinism thesis be true and the free will thesis. And so they accept this, and they reject the free will thesis. The hard determinist thinks that we do not have free will. Our token hard determinist who we're reading in this class is de Holbach, and de Holbach gives some compelling arguments for why you might be a hard determinist. Some of them just have to do with the kind of creatures we are, and he recognizes, look, we are creatures who are in this world. We are natural creatures. We are animals. We are guided by the laws of nature. Not only do our bodies obey the laws of nature, but everything that we think and breathe and everything that we do, even though we have this experience of the world, and we've talked about first-person experiences when we were talking about the mind-body problem. We were talking about what it is to experience something from the first-person perspective. He says, nonetheless, you're still a physical creature. You're a human being. You're a human animal, and you are subject to physical laws. And because you're subject to physical laws, everything that happens to you is part of a causal chain and is part of the natural world. So nothing happens to you that is outside of the causal chain of the world, and you are subject to the laws of nature just like a rock falling down a hill. It may seem as if you do have free will from the inside, and he's happy to talk about what it feels like to have free will, but he's going to think this is no more of an illusion than it is when you look at a pencil that's halfway in water. The pencil looks bent, but it's not. We experience illusions all the time. We experience visual illusions and auditory illusions, and we feel things that aren't there. You look at the horizon, the world looks flat, but it's not. So there are lots of things that seem to be the case that after we do some digging and we realize the kind of world that it is, it turns out that the way things seem aren't that way in fact. And hard determinists think free will is like that. It's an illusion. You're not really free. The next is let's do libertarian. This is not the political view, this is the view in free will. And the libertarian accepts, as you can imagine, 1 and 3, but rejects 2. So insofar as the causal determinism thesis says every event is caused, ignoring the first one. Every event is caused, ignoring the first one. If that's what the causal determinism thesis says, according to the libertarian, they say it's not true. It's not true because every time we act freely, every time you are an agent who makes a free decision, you are not being causally determined by events before you. You are outside of this causal chain of events. And so you might think, look, sure, there are tons of reasons to think that causal determinism thesis is true. Sure, a rock rolling down a hill seems like it needs to have an explanation. It might be a causal explanation. Sure, it seems as if there is a causal chain leading up to why it is that you're doing the thing that you're doing right now. But when it comes down to it, there are too many things that seem to violate that causal chain. And the libertarian is going to think having free will is one of them. The fact that you are free and you choose to do something is evidence that there is no causal chain, or that the causal chain stops with free agents. And so the libertarian is going to accept 1. They're also going to accept that 1 and 2 are incompatible, which is why they accept 1 and 3, but they reject 2. So they think that the causal determinism thesis is false. Okay. And finally, we have the compatibilists. These are sometimes called soft determinists. I didn't go out of frame there. And as you can imagine, the compatibilists and soft determinists think free will, causal determinism thesis, but the incompatibilism thesis is false. So they accept 1 and 2. They reject 3. So the compatibilists think that the incompatibilist argument has gone wrong somewhere, and that there is a way to have free will and a causal chain of events to embrace your pseudoscientific worldview and also to embrace free will, that we can have our cake and eat it too. One of the ways that they do this is they say that the incompatibilist thesis, the reasons for thinking that this is true, gets its mileage by assuming a certain definition of what it is to be free. So the compatibilists will ask you, what is it? What is it to be free and to have a free choice and to act freely? And they're going to give a variety of answers, but one thing that they're going to make sure is that it is not acting uncausedly. Right? So it's not something where if you act, that act is uncaused. And one of the things that the compatibilists are going to argue is that anybody giving reasons for the incompatibilism thesis is assuming that to be free and to act freely, to make a free choice, is to act uncausedly, to act in such a way that nothing else but your decision caused it to come into being. And the compatibilists are going to argue that if you define free as acting uncausedly, if you say the free will thesis is agents sometimes act uncausedly, if that's what you mean, then of course it's going to violate 2. They are logically incompatible. So if that's how you define free will, then of course they're incompatible. So what's the compatibilist solution? Well, don't act free. Don't define freedom that way. Define what it is for an agent to be free, where being free doesn't mean acting uncausedly. And you have some other kind of notion of freedom. And what that is something we're going to explore. But the idea is we can come up with a definition of free will and what it is to act freely that is compatible with the causal determinism thesis, insofar as we can make sure that what it is to be free isn't just acting uncausedly. And that's how the compatibilist is going to try and get it so that, yes, you have free will, and the causal determinism thesis is true, and we can reject 3. Okay, so those are the 3 views that we're going to be looking at in the next week or so. Hard determinism accepts 2 and 3 and rejects 1. Libertarianism accepts 1 and 3 and rejects 2. And finally, the compatibilist, which accepts 1 and 2 and rejects 3.